for today, March 17th, 2021. And do we have any public comment request?
No, sir.
None? Okay, we'll move to the approval section, and item 1 is the minutes for the meeting of February 17th.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we approve the minutes as presented here.
Have a motion, or a second?
I'd had an error and was unable to attend that one in my calendar, so I wasn't here.
Okay, well, I'll second that motion. All in favor, raise your right hand, please, for approval. Okay, carries 2 and abstain.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Item 2 is the property and liability insurance renewal. Mr. McGinty, you're up to bat.
Take the mask down or talk through it?
You may take it down.
Certainly.
Thank you. The property liability package for the Water Sewer Commission renewed March 15th, and we found the coverage contingent on approval by this body and the commission. We were a little bit late getting our renewal data this year, and with COVID, everything's moving slower, so we didn't get our numbers to staff in time to present at your last series of meetings.
Understood.
The liability package, which is with Travelers, is up $4,481 to $99,119. That's a 4.7% increase. The auto liability actually went down a couple $1,000 because the vehicle count reduced somewhat from last year. The automobile physical damage is up a little bit. The count reduced some, but there were several new vehicles that were high-valued vehicles added to the policy, and premium for auto physical damage is based in part on the cost new of the vehicle. We moved the coverage to Travelers last year from Guard at a pretty significant savings, and what we're seeing in the marketplace right now is pretty much increases across the board for most of our medium to larger accounts in the 5 to 10%, in some cases even higher range. Commercial property is suffering the most pressure on rates, and we're seeing rates increases there from 10 to 20% or more on larger coastal property accounts. We were fortunate to keep the property renewal for the Water and Sewer Commission at a 15%, 14.7%, or excuse me, 15.3% increase from last year. Initially, they wanted a higher premium. We were able to negotiate it down. We got them down $7,000 from where they originally quoted. We also shopped the property among all the markets we know that are active in accounts of this size on the coast, and we did not have one other competing with. The property market's probably as tight as I've seen it since 07, 08 in terms of insurers that are willing to quote property on the coast in large values, and that in fact it's gotten down to maybe a handful of insurance markets that are actively looking for coastal property.
Okay, I've read the information. It's pretty straightforward in my view. I'd like to entertain a motion.
I'll make a motion that the Brunswick-Glynn Joint Water and Sewer Finance Committee recommend the Commission approve insurance renewal rates for each coverage category and insurer as listed in the attached memo provided by the staff.
I'll second it.
Second. Any discussion or questions?
The cyber liability, is that, that's becoming a much bigger thing now?
It's getting a lot of press for sure in the marketplace. We're encouraging all of our commercial accounts that have a online presence to take cyber liability. It's I was reading something yesterday, I guess, where I think 30,000 folks were hacked as a result of the Microsoft weakness in their Exchange servers. Fortunately, McGinney Gordon was on Exchange server, but we went to the cloud a year or two ago, so we weren't one of those 30,000. But it is a big problem, and municipalities and water and sewer are one of the targets of terrorists. So I was pleased to see that the cyber liability renewed for the same premium as last year.
Did we get a lot of exclusions specifically with that, or for that matter, there are a lot of exclusions surrounding COVID around our liability? I'm just seeing other industries are having a lot of exclusions specifically with COVID. They're, you know, we're not covering this, we're not covering that.
Yeah, COVID is an issue for pretty much all lines of coverage. I don't really see much exposure for COVID on the cyber liability side. I may be missing.
I'm in on the general liability for the specifically COVID.
Yeah, there's definitely COVID exclusions in the general liability and the property policy. What they've added is to make it clear that what their intent was originally was not to cover disease. I mean, that's kind of like a war event, which is not insurable because it's can cause such widespread damage that no insurer can afford to pay claims on all their policies. Getting coverage for COVID is definitely a challenge until the federal government comes up with something like they did for terrorism to support some public-private partnership. COVID coverage is going to be pretty much unattainable for most folks.
Okay. Other questions, comments?
We'll say the proposed increase here is included in the proposed budget we'll be going over shortly.
Yep. Understood. Is that clear to committee?
Yes.
He's already baked that into our plan for the
Right,
year.
yes.
Okay. All right, with that, I'll take a vote. All those in favor of the motion as stated, raise your right hand, please. Thank you. That carries. Thank you, Fred. And next, item 3, the surplus inventory.
Yes, sir. Now that we're going through the meter changeout program, prior to starting the program, we had purchased some Metron meters. They are cellular meters that we had been using. If you recall, we've had a good deal of issue with these meters with the registers failing on them. They are digital registers, and so we can't read them when they fail. Now that we're swapping all the meters out, we are no longer using Metron meters, so we have 18 meters on the shelf that we would like to declare as surplus so that we can get rid of them since we're no longer using these meters.
I'll move that the Finance Committee recommend to the full commission to approve the above listed items as surplus to be disposed of in a manner most beneficial to joint water sewer.
I'll second the motion.
Okay, any questions, comments?
Are we likely to sell these to someone?
Somebody will buy these, yes, sir.
Right,
Even if it's not another municipality, somebody will buy these and send them overseas at the very least.
So the unit cost was what we paid for it?
Yes, sir. We will not get that value back
No,
for
I-
them,
I didn't
but
think-
we will get something back for these meters. yes,
Right.
sir.
It has an eBay-ish kind of a trend to it, I think.
Very much so. The scratch and dent sale.
Other questions, comments? Okay, I'll call the question for the motion. All those in favor? Show of hands, 3-0. Thank you very much. And then we'll go to the discussion. Andrew, it's up to you for the budget.
Okay. In your packet, you will find about a 16-page document with a little more detail than what's going to be in this presentation. There's also the line item detail in there as well. We can certainly answer questions about those if it's not included in this presentation. This is on for discussion. The intention was to get your feedback today and make adjustments for potential approval of the fiscal year 22 budget at the April meeting. So our goals in this budget year were to maintain our rate affordability. We're going through the master planning process, which will be presented to the full commission tomorrow. That is going to require us to increase our capital funding along the way. We want to improve our emergency preparedness and also improve our online customer service options. So highlights, as of when this was prepared last Wednesday, no rate increase is being requested. We were able to increase our repair and replacement reserve funding by a small amount. We increased our capital costs for equipment replacements and aged rolling stock. And then we made some recent cost-saving decisions over the past year with the biosolids changes that we made, the going to the self-funded insurance instead of fully funded insurance, and the changes we made for new employee pension, those are all reflected, and you'll see how that impacted our budget. First, we'll talk about the revenues. Overall budget went down 300, so to $33,300,000, that's a $107,000 decrease. It's being budgeted in a little bit of different areas, and that's for a couple of reasons. One, our water revenues and sewer revenues have been lagging for the last 18 months for whatever reason. So we reduced those. However, we are replacing these meters, and we are accounting for 2,500 meters that are currently not transmitting, and assuming an average bill on those 2,500 meters. So you'll see a slight increase on the sewer. There is a decrease on the water side, and you can see those numbers in your packet. We also reduced the leak adjustment a little bit, simply because as we get more of these new meters on, we'll be able to alert customers that they have a leak before they are able to run up these large balances, so you'll see a reduction there. And then you'll see that the other revenues portions, the debt charges and the admin fees are not proposed to change as of right now. The other income, the other revenues, you'll see some of those went up, service fees went up $300,000, and that's simply because we have been running over $700,000 in those revenues for the past 3 years. So we have been offsetting the water revenues that have been lower through those charges for the past 3 years, and we just allocated it more appropriately this year in the budget. Planning and construction fees went down just a little bit. We've made some changes in the way we were charging some of those to make it a little more consistent, so we're seeing a little lower revenue there. Interest income on our reserves, we decreased based off market conditions. So we assumed a 1% return on that for the year, based off of our projected balances.
Is this also, does that interest, I can't talk, does that adjustment also to account for the lowering due to the returning of the deposits?
Yes. Yes, we assumed 50% of the deposits would be returned, and we assumed the repair and replacement reserve will be drawn down over the next year as we go through these large projects as well. So that's all included in there.
Why are the water and sewer revenues down?
Don't have a great answer for that. We're hoping that we'll get a little more revenue when we put the new meters in. We do not assume any improvements in the revenues from meter inaccuracies in this program. But what I did is I went back 30 months and took the average monthly rates, and it just, we're not hitting those targets on water and sewer revenues right now. So I don't know if it's new construction with smaller usage fixtures and things of that nature. We're just not seeing the same amount of usage per customer.
And in 2020?
Than in 2020. Well, no, in the current, but we're basically, the new budget is on pace with last year's budget, except for the 2,500 accounts that were getting failed registers and getting minimum bills. So we assumed an average bill for those customers.
Did we get less revenue in 2020 than we did 2019?
Yes, sir.
Water and sewer?
Yes, sir. Off of water and sewer revenues, yes, sir.
How much
It was,
less?
$300,000 or $400,000.
What percent is that?
300,000 or 400,000 on 33 million,
1%.
Yeah.
1.2%, something like that. So revenue highlights, as we talked about, increased usage revenues due to replacement of failed meter registers. You know, the projected revenue from admin and debt charges increased slightly simply because we've got more customers in the last year, and so they'll get that minimum bill each month. And then, of course, we reduce the interest income.
What about the REU audits that are ongoing? Is there any assumptions made for the base budget in here based on the
Yes, that is
REU audits?
included in the customer count. The REUs that's in the administrative charge and the debt charge, or the debt charge, not the admin charge, the debt charge. So the customer count is the REU count, so there are some assumptions built into that. Budget expenses, 35% personnel expenses, 31% operating expenses. Reserve transfers, we have 2 reserve transfers included here. There's the R&R reserve and then the capital reserve, which shows up on the project report. 22% debt service, not including the GFO loans from Academy Creek and the meter projects. Those are paid for out of the R&R reserve. The debt service on the bonds that we have, the bond refunding we did, is 9% of the budget. Governing body accounts for 1% of the budget, and then capital expenditures, which includes about $696,000 of new equipment purchases, plus the last year of the backcom lease that was signed 4 years ago. Next year's budget hopefully will that lease program will be over, we could trade those VACCons in for a substantial trade-in value, redo that lease program so that we don't end up having to buy a $400,000 VACCon and get an even lower lease payment next time because of the trade-in value on those assets.
Okay.
So we did end up, we combined two positions into one, so in the budget, there's a reduction of staffing from 157 to 156. This does include a cost of living adjustment based off the CPI of 1.79%. We have done a good job in the past 2 or 3 years, and again, in this budget, we're requesting to replace a good deal of the aged capital assets that we have. So we've seen a reduction in our equipment maintenance costs, which is good to see, showing that we're making progress there. Remember, we made the changes to the health insurance and the pension plan, and we also saw a reduction in workers' comp. So even though there's a cost of living adjustment included in here, there's actually a very small decrease in personnel costs this year compared to last year's budget. And then we had an overall reduction in operating expenses. When we went through the budget process, we told everybody basically hold your top line budget the same. If you want to buy capital equipment items and you want to request those, you got to take it out of the rest of your budget items. So since obviously not every capital item they requested is included in the budget, there is a reduction in operating expenses. So by division, you can see we're spread out. The two big ones there, wastewater treatment and systems pumping, so sewer's about 47% of the budget. One that's you'll see is a much bigger piece of the pie this year than last year's finance, because we moved all of the group insurance to finance so that we don't have to know the claims history and to parse it out to the individual budgets. So that's why you'll see finance budget is much higher this year than it was last year.
What kind of general benchmark across the industry is there for these high-level buckets? And not that you can really do benchmarking across the side, organizations that are so different, but you can at least kind of understand where you stand, whether you're in the first percentile or 99th.
Right. So on that, the AWWA, American Water Works Association benchmarking study was just released about a week ago. So we have ordered our copies. It will be here hopefully in the next 3 or 4 days.
I'd be curious to have a future presentation on something like that, or just how we benchmark in all the different categories. Again, understanding that it's not apples and apples.
Sure.
That, we might be way over on one thing, way under on another, and that's okay because of the geography, because of the type of business, because of the, the size of the community, whatever. But it'd still be neat to know kind of how we, where we land.
So absolutely, as soon as we get that in, we can put that together for you. Assuming that the mail gets it here, we can have that for you next meeting.
At the next what?
At the next, the April meeting. We should probably have that prepared by then. All right, so increases in the line items that you'll see throughout there, Academy Creek chemicals, for those of you that didn't study a bunch of chemistry in college. O2 is oxygen, CO2 is chlorine, and SO2 is sulfur dioxide. That is a dechlorination chemical. We are having to increase the amount of biomass we're holding at the plant, so we have to use more oxygen to treat. Cl2 chlorine is used for disinfection. With the new permit limits we have for enterococci, we are pumping about 3 times as much chlorine as we were. And if you pump 3 times as much chlorine, you got to dechlor at the same amount. So that is why all 3 of those have increased. Those are permit-driven changes.
How much is that increase? What percent increase is it?
Oxygen's up $100,000 on a $650,000 budget, so that's about 12–13%. And then the chlorine budget's up $30,000 or $40,000, so that's about a 50% increase there. And then SO2 is in a similar range. I don't remember the exact line item on SO2 there, but that is in that ballpark. I can pull that up in just a minute.
So generally, regulatory changes is costing us $150,000 to $160,000 a year additional just in chemicals.
Just in chemicals, yes. So
I know when we looked at auction a long time ago, we kind of compared it against some other industries in town, and we felt like our auction usage was a little higher, but it was because we were low volume. But as we grow in volume, that might be worth looking again at some point.
Right. Absolutely something to take a look at. Property and casualty insurance, as Mr. McGinty just informed us, we did build in a rate increase into that for this year's budget. Telephone, you'll see the telephone line item has went up a pretty good bit, and that's one that catches a lot of attention. One of those is we have a handful of AT&T FirstNet phones, which in a storm event, we get priority access to the cell towers through AT&T, even before everyone else gets their cell phones back online. And then we're doing a SCADA project, and every one of those stations is going to have a cellular modem at them, so there's a phone bill for every one of the stations. However, there are tremendous benefits to doing it that way versus using radio frequency to a water tower, because then if something happens to the receiver at the tower, you can't see 20 or 30 stations at one time. With the cell phone approach, if one of them goes out, you can't see one of them, not 30 of them. Capital replacements, there's vehicle replacements included in there. There's a detailed list in the back of the packet that you have, but three main ones to point out that are major. UV modules for Southport. We are looking at buying drop-in modules for the UV system at Southport. That is a $90,000 expense. That would be from Wedeco, as they are the provider of the UV system. Pump station 4006 on Altama Avenue has always been slated for a third pump. It is valved and everything's ready to go there for the third pump, so we'd like to buy that third pump and put it in there. That'd be a Flight, I believe that is a 185 horsepower Flight pump. And then a new bypass pump for pump stations. We do have permanent bypass pumps at, I think, 10 stations now. We currently own 3 portable bypass pumps, and 2 of them are in pretty rough shape, so the request is to replace one of those this year and potentially one of those next year. Decreases, banking and investment fees. We talked about some changes we made earlier. When we changed the investment bank we were using to Synovus, our investment fees have dropped drastically. So you'll see a reduction in investment fees in that line item. Biosolids disposal, we, at the beginning of last year's budget, made the change to start hauling that sludge ourselves. We were able to reduce that line item even further this year with a full year worth of data. Group insurance is down a couple $100,000, 350 from last year, going from fully funded to self-funded. And what we did on that was assume the fully funded costs minus what they were giving us, so that number is probably even conservative that we have in there. Purchased equipment repairs, again, replacing these aged assets that we have is reducing the amount of time they're in the shop, so we're not having to spend as much money on the equipment repairs we're doing. And then if you recall, in December, when we renewed the workers' comp, that reduced over $50,000 from last year's budget. So this is sort of a summary slide. This excludes capital purchases because when you pull the old data after the year, the finance folks have already added it to the fixed asset register, and I can't get to that anymore. But the green bar at the bottom is the operating expenses. So you're looking at 4 full years worth of data and then the budget for this year. As you can see, our operating expenses have remained pretty consistent for the last 5 years, including the proposed budget. The debt service, as you would expect, as you're paying your debt service off, it is reducing ever so slightly as we go along. So
Can we have that slide in our package?
No.
that slide is not in the
Okay.
packet. It's the numbers off of that last page in your actual packet. And then the top is the R&R transfers. In 2018, we transferred $3.5 million to R&R. In the proposed budget, we're over $7 million. So in the past 4 years, we've made a lot of operational changes and efficiency improvements that we've doubled the amount of money we have for capital projects.
Wait, say those last two, what went from 3 to 7 million?
2018, the R&R transfer, so project transfer was $3.5 million.
Oh, in
for the year.
2018, okay.
For this year, it's just over $7 million. So it is my philosophy that we get more bang for our buck with capital dollars than with operational dollars. So I keep trying to drive more and more funds to that capital.
Well, I think that's impressive, and I think that's a testament to you and your team and what y'all been able to do, and continuing to look at operations and looking for, added efficiencies. And I hope we're able to continue to look for those things, because
Absolutely.
Yeah, you've done outstanding, really, to wring out essentially $4.5 million since in the last 4 years.
So go through it now in your packet. I won't go through these line by line by any stretch, but you'll see the priorities that I presented at the workshop included there. So those will be our organizational priorities for the year. And then the actual revenue numbers here, that, like I said, sewer revenues increased slightly once we went in and added those 2,500 accounts in that were getting 0 bills, or minimum bills, not 0 bills. Water revenues, even with that add, are way down. And then, of course, minor changes to debt service and admin fees because of the RU count and the customer count. And then you see we reduced interest income a good bit based off of existing market conditions. And then the other income, again, the vast majority of that $423,000, $300,000 of that is changing the service fees budget from $300,000 to $600,000. And the last 3 years, we've had over 700,000 in that account, so we were remaining conservative there. So the overall reduction is 107,000. Expense type, the governing body expenses did not change this year. I will say, we did include funding for all 7 commissioners if we were to make that change for their monthly stipend. Personnel changes, saved $4,750 in this budget. Operating expenses way down. Capital costs increased $80,000. But again, those are all individually listed in your packet. Debt service down, just as you pay it off, you pay less money. And then reserves were increased almost $300,000. On an individual budget total from 2021 to 2022, you see minor changes in most of these, significant decrease in finance due to the insurance costs and the reserve investment costs, fees that we're going in there. And then systems pumping and maintenance, there's been a bit of a failure to execute that budget, so the budget was reduced simply because we haven't been executing that as effectively as we needed to. Wastewater treatment went up $190,000 because they got about $125,000 more in capital in this year's budget than they did in last year's budget. So, highlights again, if you want to read through there, if there's a tie-in to the budget for what we're looking at for the organizational goals, you will see those listed there. And then the capital request, we talked about the bypass pump, SP&M, so that's Kirk Young's group, Systems Pumping and Maintenance, is also requesting a 2-ton work truck to replace their one of their construction crew trucks. Those trucks get worked hard, and they're rolling those out one a year at this point. And then a work van for hauling electrical materials around. The one we have is kind of on its last legs. The 4006 new pump we talked about. Wastewater treatment, the UV modules are $90,000. We talked about that. They're requesting a rubber-tired excavator. That's what they currently use to move the sludge offloading containers around on site, and the one they have now is becoming a maintenance headache. We're spending money every month trying to keep that thing running. And then in the lab, they're needing a new refrigerated sampler for Southport, and then their UV spectrophotometer is in need of replacement. That is a very small machine, but it does cost $10,000. So we have that. Production, we replaced one of their chlorine distribution trucks last year, the 1-ton work truck with the lift gate on the back. They're requesting a replacement this year for that. Distribution, the roof at the Harrington facility needs to be replaced, so we've got money in here to replace the roof at the Harrington facility. They would be getting a new excavator and then another 2-ton work truck for them. Their crews have 2-ton work trucks, and that is because they haul excavators to and from sites all day long. And then our historical expenses here, you kind of see where we're at. Expenses year to date are down a little bit, as we've been talking about. However, you see this year's budget is in line with the previous 3 years as well. Although, again, I'll point out at the bottom, the debt service decrease and increase in reserve transfers to $7,089,000.
What assumption did you carry for the old CBS building?
0. Talked about most of these, but there's the individual line items. I'll hit the high points. Again, reductions in investment income, increase in service fees. Those are pretty prevalent there. You'll see a reduction across the board in education expenses because we still don't know when we're going to be able to actually start going back to class. We want to make sure we train our folks up, but not a lot of travel associated with those expenses in this year's budget.
But you do anticipate being able to go back to some normal, right?
Some level of normal. We've got money in here to do some of the in-state traveling. We're kind of putting the brakes on a lot of the out-of-state stuff that we
Right,
used to do
sure,
right now until
yeah.
we know more about what's going to go on. And we've had 3 people that were taking education assistance, and 2 of them will be finishing before the end of the year, so their allotment is much smaller than what it had been. So, you see the the finance has 3 line items that are fairly substantially lower, and bill printing and mailing. One of the things we worked on, if you look at one of our goals, is we're trying to increase our paperless billing. So that is going pretty well thus far. Plus, we are going to reduce the printing on the second page of the document. So not having to pay postage and printing for those paperless bills and then only printing one side of the paper, we're projecting about a $50,000 savings in our bill printing and mailing costs.
Okay, good.
That is handled by a third party, so certainly that will pay dividends down the road. And then, let's see, procurement, you'll see a large increase in purchase building maintenance because that is where the facilities group has been relocated to, the remaining facilities employees. So building maintenance for this facility is included in that line item. But if you recall, the former facilities maintenance budget was $600,000. So still coming out ahead on that deal. And then systems pumping, again, they took a pretty good cut. Some of that was in personnel line items, interest expense. Their interest expense is off of that VACCON lease. There's only 6 months of that VACCON lease, so we only have to make one interest payment. So that's why that is way lower than what it had been. They also saw a reduction in their, not a reduction, they saw a reduction in one item, but it picked up in vehicles, so I'll take that back. Lift stations, we're reducing the odor control budget for lift stations because we have found a more cost-effective way of treating odors at these stations than pouring chemicals down the drain. So, reducing that will be to buy odor control equipment for the stations instead of the purchase of chemicals. Again, wastewater treatment, you see an increase in machinery and equipment. Wastewater treatment is split up. There's the general cost, which is essentially your personnel cost and your tool cost in the 4331 line item, 4335 line items. And then Academy Creek, Dunbar Creek, and Southport have separate line items for their actual maintenance cost. So that's why there's 4 wastewater budgets. But we talked about the $100,000 increase on the oxygen costs. Chlorine went up $40,000 and sulfur dioxide went up $8,000. So that's, all right at $150,000 in increase in chemicals from the permitted change.
What kind of depreciation increase are you expecting when all the improvements, Academy Creek, and when will those come online? When will those start hitting?
The project is expected to be completed in February. We do not budget depreciation in the annual budget. It is taken care of as part of the audit every year, correct? As the assets come online, yes. So it is not part of, depreciation is not a budgeted line item for us.
Explain that again, Tom.
Once the asset is placed into service, that's when the depreciation on it begins.
That's what I was asking, when is that gonna start?
Project is expected to be completed by February.
Gotcha. So, but you said it's not included in the operating budget.
Because we don't budget for depreciation.
So it's gonna come online, it's gonna hit, but I'm just not following what you're saying.
It offsets the fixed assets.
So what you're saying, if I understand correctly, is we have an asset value system-wide, and then as we take depreciation on a new asset, that's just lowers the value of the total asset value.
That's correct. It's a balance sheet rather than an income statement item.
Yeah.
Right. Oh, I'm with you now.
We don't pay taxes, so.
Yeah, I'm with you now.
that will reduce the depreciation. Okay. We also included the system, there's a reduction in uniforms across the board for the uniform changes. Those will be ordered here in the next month or so. And so we'll get those in May or so, and then we'll get another allotment in July, so they get the double whammy of kicking off the uniform program.
Mhm.
But across the board, you'll see some items went up and down, but a lot of similar costs. And staff did a good job with their budget this year, presenting budgets that did not require a great deal of changes, because our 5-person budget team was down to 3 people this year, so me and Ms. Madonna and Ms. Francis, we're very appreciative of that, so.
So long and short of it is we're flat for this next year in terms of our forecasted cost and our revenues, which is a good thing. Okay.
Andrew, in general, what is our process like when somebody leaves the organization voluntarily for the department directors to get that position reapproved? I mean, is it an automatic, or they have to kind of come to you and say, hey, this position is now vacant, I believe I need it, this is my justification, I'd like to get it?
Every position that is vacant, I have to sign off on before it is published on the website for approval, for filling. And then every hire that is made, I review before that position is filled as well.
Perfect.
specific questions, line items, or overall totals that I can discuss?
Now, I'll just say again, I think that's a great job on, kind of that 5-year trend you showed. I mean, I know you specifically been a huge piece of that, but also all your team. I just think this was a great job.
One of the things I want to offer that's connected to this, while we know the results of the local vote yesterday, the SPLOST did not pass, we still have the need for that $15 million funding over the 3 years for the projects that we listed. And what I'd ask is that we can do some review of how we self-fund that. Self-funding means we increase rates or we borrow money to pay a debt service, and I think we need to understand what that is, so let's do that. If we can get just a very high-level review of that in prep for tomorrow's commission meeting, I think it'd be beneficial for all commissioners to understand that as one option to evaluate as we go forward. We'll have to make some decisions pretty soon on that.
Yes, sir. So those, we'll certainly have you something tomorrow for discussion with that, and that's,
So, we can have that for you, and then any suggested changes from that discussion can be incorporated before the April presentation to the budget without any issues.
Okay.
I will say, so this meeting, we presented a proposed capital projects list that is, that $7 million in R&R that's included in here is accounted for on a capital projects plan.
Understood. Any other questions or comments for Andrew regarding our proposed budget? This will come before the full commission for next month to vote on. So that's kind of where, we're sort of nucleus, if you will, on finance. They'll push it forward to our peers for their endorsement too. Questions or comments for item number 1? Thank you, Andrew. Very, very concise, plenty of granularity for us to understand, and congrats on submitting a budget that's essentially flat, which is good for our ratepayers.
thank you.
Item 2, Ms. Wilson.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Before you, the item before you are the financials as of February the 28th, 2021. First on the list is our balance sheet. If I can bring your attention to the accounts receivable balance. This line item is made up of customer accounts receivable, donations receivable, interest receivable, and tower rental receivables. And it's, of course, offset by the allowance for bad debts. Even though our customer receivables were a little higher this month, the overall total is lower. We did receive a check from Utility Service Group, the company that managed their tank rentals. That check was $298,914.81. So that brought our overall balance down. Note of interest, customer receivable balance for February 2021 was a little over $1.5 million. This time last year, it was a little over $1.7 million, so we're coming down. 2019, we're almost $3.4 million. So staff has done a tremendous job of managing accounts receivable and keeping that balance down. Down to current liabilities, we have accounts payable. That number is down from our January balance of $737,000. If we go over to other liabilities, we have our customer deposits payable. Staff started applying deposits to eligible residential customers in February. That balance came down from January by $128,649. The list was completed last week for a total of 6,709 accounts that had their deposits refunded, for a total of $609,000. Yesterday, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
I was gonna say, yesterday afternoon, I ran the customer deposits report, and it was at $2.5 million.
The overwhelming majority of the deposits have been, for the residential customers, occurred in the last 2 weeks, and the cutoff for this was February 28th. So all residential deposits that are eligible that we discussed have been applied as of last week.
Yes, and February reports will pick up that total of those.
I think you anticipated what I was fixing to ask, is
Yes. Yes.
why there's such a big discrepancy. I mean, and I was hoping you were gonna say, no, that's interest we've set on over time, but is there, I mean, so the difference between the customer deposit reserve and the deposits payable is simply recent ones timing? There's no interest sitting there that we could
Very little.
allocate somewhere else? Okay,
Very little.
all right, fair enough.
On to the statement of cash balances. Cash balances are slightly down from January, about like 291,000, but overall holding steady. At the bottom, we have our customer deposit reserve, and as we just talked about, our March 31st statements will reflect the completion of that and the drawdown of funds. Summary of revenue. Mr. Burrows covered some of this, so,
Sorry.
water and sewer revenues are down, but they are less under budget this month than they were this time last year, by like almost $200,000, so.
Okay.
How do they trend over time?
As it was a year ago.
Ours, we see a reduction in December, January, and February more than any other month. We don't see tremendous seasonal swings because it doesn't really ever get cold here, and most of the irrigation customers we have irrigate most year-round. There is a slight fluctuation. Obviously, March, April, May, you start picking up as you get more tourists in town. So March to October.
Year.
Year over year, it's been pretty flat.
I'm just curious, I mean, several years ago, we changed our rate structure to be more of a flat rate for that,
Right.
you know, and the whole thing was about rate stability. I was not 100% sold on the math then, and
Right.
nor am I now, but I was just curious how that.
It's been pretty flat.
How that affected us over time.
As he mentioned, other income includes service fees, bad debt recovery, and tower rentals, so that number is up due to those factors. And interest income is under budget, under the projected budget, at, just because not making much interest. On to, the expenses. As Mr. Burrows mentioned, education, training, and travel are under budget across the board. I ran the numbers this morning, and they're under budget by $104,000 to date. And again, it's starting to, online classes are picking up a little, but most travel is not happening. Finance department, group insurance is under budget by $350,000. And of course, the reserve banking investment fees are also under budget by like $100,000. We switched, and therefore we're not being assessed as many fees. So that was a good change. Any questions on expenses by division? On the project report? The East Beach Demery Sewer Improvement Project has been completed. That's project 2008. That will be moved to the bottom of the report as it is capitalized. And expenses have increased by a little over $1 million since the January 31st statement.
We were about 900,000 in capital expenses in January. We were over $1 million in February. So we talked about last meeting that project expenses are increasing.
Yep.
Any questions?
Just wait till March.
Yeah, and in March, we just bought a lot of meters, so it's going to go up a lot.
It's going to go up dramatically, okay.
Yeah, kind of how I'm looking at it is getting inside the glide path.
Yes.
Okay, as we're going to land the end of the fiscal year. So we're starting to come into convergence.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
At one time, I thought, and maybe it wasn't on this report of mine, it's about Bill and Tricks, but, you know, as far as looking at the over and under budget year to date, that is actual over and under year to date.
Correct.
I thought we had an annualized column in there so we could see what that number was kind of annualized over and under budget, how we're tracking against
We
it.
do a quarterly,
Okay,
and that next month will happen. There'll be a little extra couple of columns in there along with the health insurance costs.
So we've been adding that quarterly.
okay, that's what I was confused about. Because it's nice to be able to see how you're tracking versus, I mean, you know, if you're, $100,000 over budget, that's great, but if that's 1/12 of the year, you're really
Right.
1.2.
Exactly.
And I think it skews a little bit when you got the purchase orders, and there's nothing you can do about that, it just kind of, because the purchase orders might be front-loaded, might be a year's commitments, even though it's,
Right.
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 But yeah, we'll have that quarterly.
okay,
forward.
perfect.
Any other questions or comments? Thank you, Francis, very good. Okay, that's the end of our agenda. Are there any other general items of interest before the Finance Committee?
No, sir.
Okay, hearing none, we're adjourned. Thank you very much.